The year 1221 cast a long shadow over Asia. Genghis Khan, the Mongol warlord, was on the move. His armies, vast and ruthless, had already swallowed kingdoms. From the steppes of Mongolia to the borders of Europe, his name was whispered with fear and awe. Now the great Khan turned his gaze south, towards the riches of India. It wasn't just the Mongol warriors that terrified the people. A silent killer marched alongside them, the Black Death. This plague, unseen and merciless, transformed healthy villagers into rotting corpses within days. Its touch was a death sentence, leaving a trail of despair in its wake. Across the plains and over the mountains, the rumours spread like wildfire. From the Punjab to Bengal, the people of India braced themselves. Their world, once ordered and prosperous, was about to be consumed by chaos. The Mongols were a force unlike any other. They were disciplined, ruthless, and driven by an insatiable hunger for conquest. Their horsemen, masters of the saddle and bow, could cover vast distances with astonishing speed. Their armies were equipped with advanced siege weapons, capable of shattering the strongest fortifications. The people of India, accustomed to the rhythms of peace, were ill-prepared for the storm that was about to break. They were farmers, artisans, and merchants, not soldiers. Their armies, trained for local conflicts, were no match for the Mongol war machine. And as if the threat of invasion wasn't enough, the Black Death cast a pall over everything. High in the Himalayas, nestled among snow-capped peaks and verdant valleys, lay the village of Kimak. Life here flowed at a slower pace, dictated by the rhythms of nature and the seasons. The villagers were a hardy people, their lives intertwined with the land, their days filled with the simple rhythms of farming, weaving and storytelling. Arjan, a young man on the cusp of adulthood, stood at the edge of his family's rice paddy. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. But beneath the tranquility, a current of unease ran through him, a disquiet he couldn't shake off. The rumours had reached even their remote village, carried by traders and travellers from the west. Tales of unimaginable brutality, of cities razed to the ground, of entire populations put to the sword. The Mongols were coming, and with them the shadow of the Black Death. Arjan's father, Baldev, was a man of quiet strength and wisdom. He had seen much in his lifetime, weathered many storms that had threatened their peaceful existence. But even he seemed troubled by the news, his weathered face etched with a deep concern that he tried but failed to conceal from his son. The village elders, their faces lined with years of toil and experience, gathered in the evenings under the flickering light of oil lamps. They spoke in hushed tones, debating the best course of action. Some argued for fleeing into the mountains, seeking refuge in the high passes where no army could follow. Others, their voices laced with fear, spoke of appeasement, of offering gifts and tribute to the Mongol Khan in the hope of escaping his wrath. But even as they spoke, they knew that the Mongols were a force unlike any they had ever encountered. Days turned into weeks, each sunrise bringing a fresh wave of anxiety to Kimak. The whispers on the wind grew stronger, carrying with them the stench of fear and the echo of distant screams. The villagers went about their daily tasks with a forced normalcy, their hearts heavy with dread. Arjan found himself drawn to the stories told by the village elders, tales of ancient battles and forgotten heroes. He yearned for a glimmer of hope, a sign that they could somehow weather this storm. But the stories, steeped in the lore of their ancestors, offered little comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, bathing the village in a soft orange glow, a haggard figure stumbled into the village square. It was a trader, his clothes torn, his eyes wide with terror. He had journeyed for weeks, evading Mongol patrols, his caravan looted and scattered. The villagers gathered around him, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear. The trader spoke of unimaginable horrors, of villages decimated by the plague, of men, women and children slaughtered without mercy. His words, delivered in a voice hoarse with exhaustion, hung in the air like a curse. That night the debate among the elders reached fever pitch, the weight of their responsibility pressed down on them, the fate of their people hanging in the balance. But no consensus could be reached. The fear of the unknown, of the unseen enemy, paralyzed them. Baldev, his usually calm demeanour shattered, argued for action. They had to do something, anything, to protect their families, their way of life, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears, lost in the cacophony of fear and indecision. Arjan, listening to the heated exchange, felt a surge of anger and frustration. Were they simply going to sit back and wait for the inevitable? Where was the courage, the resilience that he had heard about in the old stories? As darkness fell over Kimak, casting long shadows across the village, Arjan sought solace in the solitude of the nearby forest. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filled his nostrils, a familiar comfort in the face of mounting dread. He wandered aimlessly, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and uncertainty. He stumbled upon a clearing, bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the moon. In the centre stood a small shrine, its stone weathered by time, adorned with faded garlands of marigolds and jasmine. Arjan recognized it instantly, the shrine of Ma Bhairavi, the village healer and seer. He knelt before the shrine, a sense of peace washing over him. Ma Bhairavi had always been a source of comfort, her wisdom a guiding light in times of trouble. He closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer, seeking guidance, seeking strength. When he opened his eyes, he saw her standing before him. Ma Bhairavi, her wrinkled face framed by a shock of white hair, her eyes twinkling with an otherworldly light. Arjan wasn't startled. He felt no fear, only a profound sense of calm. "You carry a heavy burden, child." Ma Bhairavi's voice, though soft, seemed to resonate through him. Arjan, his throat tight with emotion, could only nod. He wanted to speak, to pour out his fears and anxieties, but no words came. "The eastern wind brings with it the stench of death," Ma Bhairavi continued, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "The Mongols are but a symptom, a harbinger of a darkness far older, far more insidious." Arjan, his heart pounding in his chest, finally found his voice. "What do you mean? What darkness?" Ma Bhairavi turned to him, her eyes boring into his. "The plague, child, is but a taste of what is to come. The Rakshasas have awakened." Arjan's blood ran cold. Rakshasas. They were creatures of myth and legend, demons spoken of in hushed whispers by the firelight. Their very name invoked images of clawed hands, gnashing teeth, and eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. They were the stuff of nightmares, not the waking world. "The Rakshasas," Arjan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "But they're just stories, aren't they?" Ma Bhairavi shook her head, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "The old stories hold truths, child, truths that men have forgotten at their peril. The Rakshasas are real as the wind and the rain, and they have been waiting for this moment, waiting for the world to weaken, for the barriers between realms to crumble." She placed a gnarled hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly strong. "The Mongols, with their thirst for blood, with the plague they carry in their wake, they have awakened something ancient, something terrible. The Rakshasas feed on fear, on despair, on the very essence of life itself, and they will not be satiated until they have consumed all that stands before them." Arjan struggled to comprehend the enormity of her words. The Mongols were terrifying enough, their reputation for brutality well deserved, But to face an enemy born of darkness, an enemy that preyed on the very essence of life itself, was beyond his comprehension. "What can we do?" Arjan asked, his voice choked with a fear he could no longer contain. "How can we possibly stand against such a foe?" Mabhairavi's gaze seemed to pierce through him, seeing into the depths of his soul. "The path ahead is fraught with peril, child," she said, her voice heavy with foreboding. "But there is always hope, even in the darkest of times. You must seek the temple of Kali, high in the mountains. There you may find the answers you seek, the strength you need to face what is to come." The weight of Mabhairavi's words settled on Arjan's shoulders like a physical burden. He returned to the village, his heart heavy with dread, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. He couldn't shake off the image of the Rakshasas, their eyes burning with a malevolent hunger, their very presence a harbinger of death. He found his father, Baldev, in the communal courtyard, his brow furrowed with worry as he listened to the latest reports from the outlying villages. The news was grim. The Mongols were advancing faster than anticipated, leaving a trail of destruction and despair in their wake. Arjan hesitated, unsure of how to tell his father about his encounter with Mabhairavi, about the Rakshasas and the impending doom that seemed to be closing in on them from all sides. His father, a man of logic and reason, would likely dismiss it as the ramblings of an old woman, a figment of an overactive imagination fueled by fear and uncertainty. But as he looked at his father's face, etched with worry and a weariness that seemed to go beyond the immediate crisis, Arjan knew he couldn't keep silent. He had to tell him, had to share the burden, however heavy it might be. "Father," Arjan began, his voice barely a whisper, "I need to speak with you. It's important." Baldev, sensing the urgency in his son's voice, excused himself from the gathering and led Arjan to a quiet corner of the courtyard, away from the prying ears and anxious whispers. He looked at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and anticipation. "What is it, Arjan?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "What troubles you so?" And so Arjan, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word, told his father about his encounter with Mabhairavi, about the Rakshasas, and about the prophecy that filled him with a dread he couldn't shake off. Baldev listened intently, his face betraying no emotion as Arjan spoke. When his son was finished, a heavy silence descended upon them, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Finally Baldev spoke, his voice low and measured. "The Rakshasas are creatures of darkness, Arjan," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Their power is not to be trifled with, but neither should their words be taken at face value. They are deceivers, tricksters who delight in sowing fear and discord among men." He placed a hand on Arjan's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "I understand your fear, your need to find a solution to this crisis, but I believe that seeking answers from such creatures is a dangerous path, one that could lead us all to ruin." Arjan, torn between his father's skepticism and the chilling certainty in Mabhairavi's voice, felt a surge of frustration. "But what choice do we have?" he pleaded. "The Mongols are coming, the plague is spreading. We need to do something, anything, to protect ourselves." Baldev sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of responsibility. "We will face this challenge as we have always faced challenges together, with courage and determination. We will fortify the village, gather our supplies and prepare to defend ourselves, and we will pray to the gods for their protection." But even as he spoke, Arjan could see the doubt in his father's eyes. The Mongols were a force unlike any they had ever encountered, their brutality legendary, and the plague, a silent killer that struck without warning, had already begun to claim its victims in the neighbouring villages. That night, as Arjan lay on his mat, sleep eluded him. The image of Mabhairavi, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and warning, haunted his thoughts. He couldn't shake off the feeling that time was running out, that they were standing on the precipice of disaster. He knew what he had to do. Before dawn broke, while the village still slumbered, Arjan gathered a few essential supplies, a waterskin, some dried fruit and nuts, his father's hunting knife, and slipped out of the hut, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked for hours, following the winding mountain path that Mabhairavi had described. The air grew thinner, the trees taller and more imposing as he ascended higher and higher, the sounds of the village fading into the distance. Finally, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the mountainside, he reached his destination. The temple of Kali stood before him, carved into the face of a sheer cliff, its dark stone walls adorned with intricate carvings of gods and demons locked in eternal struggle. A sense of foreboding washed over Arjan as he approached the temple. The air hung heavy with the scent of incense and something else, something ancient and unsettling. The entrance was guarded by two towering statues of Rakshasas, their expressions fierce and unwelcoming. As Arjan stepped across the threshold, he felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. The interior of the temple was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, the walls adorned with murals depicting scenes of both creation and destruction. At the far end of the temple, on a raised platform draped in black silk, stood a statue of Kali, the goddess of time and death. Her skin was a deep blue, her eyes blazing red. She wore a garland of skulls and a belt of severed arms. In her 4 hands she held a sword, a trident, a severed head, and a bowl of blood. Arjan, overwhelmed by the raw power that seemed to emanate from the statue, fell to his knees, his body trembling. He had come seeking protection for his village, but now, in the presence of this fearsome deity, he felt utterly insignificant, a leaf caught in the whirlwind of fate. "You seek my aid, mortal?" The voice, deep and resonant, seemed to echo from the very walls of the temple. Arjan, startled, looked around for the source but saw no one. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You stand before me, yet you question my presence." The voice boomed, closer now. "I am Kali, destroyer of worlds, devourer of time. Your heart beats with fear, your soul trembles before me. What is it you desire?" Arjan, gathering his courage, rose to his feet. "My village, it is in danger. The Mongols are coming, bringing with them death and destruction. And there is another threat, an ancient evil that has awakened. They call themselves Rakshasas. I am aware of these Rakshasas," Kali said, her voice like the crackle of flames. "They are but a symptom, a manifestation of the darkness that festers at the heart of this world. They hunger for chaos, for the taste of fear and despair." "Can you stop them?" Arjan asked, his voice filled with a desperate hope. "Can you protect my village?" A low chuckle echoed through the temple. "Protection comes at a price, mortal, a price few are willing to pay." Arjan's heart sank. "What price?" "A life for a life," Kali said, her voice cold and sharp as a blade. "Offer me a soul, pure and untainted, and I will shield your village from the Mongol horde and the hunger of the Rakshasas." Arjan hesitated, the weight of her words crushing him. To sacrifice an innocent life to save his village, was it a price he was willing to pay? As if reading his thoughts, Kali spoke again, her voice laced with a chilling amusement. "Choose wisely, mortal. Time is short and the Rakshasas grow impatient. The fate of your village, the lives of all you hold dear, hang in the balance. The journey back to Kimak seemed to take twice as long as the arduous climb to the temple. Each step was a torment, Arjan's mind a battlefield where guilt and responsibility waged war against his instincts for self-preservation. The weight of Kayle's demand pressed down on him, a suffocating dread that clung to him like a shroud. He had gone in search of salvation, a way to protect his people from the looming threats of invasion and disease, but the solution offered by the fearsome goddess was a double-edged sword, a bargain that chilled him to his core. To save his village, he had to condemn another to a horrific fate, to offer up a life as a blood sacrifice to appease a deity of death. The faces of his loved ones, etched with worry and fear, haunted his thoughts. His father Baldev, his weathered features reflecting the burden of leadership. His childhood friend Leela, her laughter silenced by the ever-present threat of the Mongols. The village elders, their wisdom failing them in the face of such overwhelming despair. Could he sacrifice one to save the many? Was such a choice even his to make? The questions circled in his mind, relentless and agonizing, offering no easy answers. The closer he got to Kimak, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers, now carried a cloying sweetness, the unmistakable odour of decay. The plague, it seemed, had tightened its grip on the surrounding villages, its invisible hand reaching ever closer to his own. As he descended the final ridge, the village came into view, nestled in the valley below. But the sight, once a source of comfort and familiarity, now filled him with a fresh wave of dread. Smoke billowed from the outskirts of the village, tendrils of black against the fading light. The sound of wailing, carried on the wind, sent shivers down his spine. Baldev, his face etched with a mixture of grief and exhaustion, greeted Arjan at the edge of the village. The usually vibrant communal courtyard was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of incense and sickness. A group of villagers, their faces drawn and pale, huddled around a pyre, their hushed whispers carrying on the wind. "It is as we feared," Baldev said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The plague has reached our doorstep. Many have already succumbed, and more fall ill with each passing hour." Arjan, his heart heavy with a guilt that had nothing to do with the plague, could only nod. He had been so consumed by his own burden, by the impossible choice presented to him by Kali, that he had failed to see the immediate danger facing his people. "I went to the temple," Arjan confessed, his voice a mere whisper. "I sought guidance, a way to protect us." Baldev, his eyes filled with a weary understanding, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know, Arjan," he said softly. "Ma Bhairavi visited me while you were gone. She told me of your quest, of the burden you now carry." Arjan looked at his father, his own despair mirrored in the older man's eyes. "She told you everything?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "About the Rakshasas? About Kali? About—" He couldn't bring himself to say it, to voice the horrific demand that weighed so heavily on his soul. Baldev nodded, his gaze steady and reassuring. "She told me of the Pact, the price that Kali demands for her protection." He led Arjan to a quiet corner of the courtyard, away from the mournful silence of the villagers. They sat on a low stone bench, the flickering light of the pyre casting long, dancing shadows around them. "Tell me what troubles you, son," Baldev said, his voice gentle but firm. "Do not carry this burden alone." And so Arjan, his voice racked with guilt and uncertainty, told his father everything. He spoke of the fearsome presence of Kali, of the chilling bargain she offered, of the impossible choice that threatened to tear him apart. Baldev listened patiently, his weathered face etched with a mixture of concern and understanding. When Arjan was finished, a heavy silence descended upon them, broken only by the crackling of the pyre and the mournful sigh of the wind. "The Rakshasas and the gods, they are forces beyond our comprehension," Baldev said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "Their ways are not our ways, their motivations shrouded in mystery." He reached out and took Arjan's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "But one thing I have learned in my lifetime is that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, we must never surrender our humanity. We must never allow fear and despair to drive us to acts that would diminish our very essence." Arjan, his heart torn between his duty to protect his people and the horrific sacrifice demanded of him, looked at his father with a mix of confusion and desperation. "But what about the village? The plague? The Mongols? They will destroy us all." Baldev nodded, acknowledging the very real threat facing them. "They are indeed formidable enemies, but we are not without hope. We will fight them with every fibre of our being, with every weapon at our disposal. And we will do so without resorting to the dark bargains offered by those who thrive on fear and despair." A newfound determination flickered in Baldev's eyes. "We will not give in to panic. We will strengthen our defences, tend to the sick and pray to the gods for their mercy, and we will face whatever fate throws at us with courage and compassion." Arjan, his heart still heavy but a glimmer of hope igniting within him, nodded slowly. His father's words resonated with a truth that transcended the impossible choice presented to him. Perhaps there was another way, a path that didn't involve sacrificing an innocent life to appease a bloodthirsty deity. "We will face this together, father," Arjan said, his voice firming with newfound resolve. "We will not give in to fear. We will find another way." A strange silence had settled over Kimak. The plague, which had ravaged the village for days, seemed to have retreated as swiftly and mysteriously as it had arrived. The cries of the sick no longer echoed through the narrow lanes, and the acrid smoke of funeral pyres no longer stained the sky. Arjan, his heart still heavy with the burden of Kali's demand, moved through the village like a ghost. He had not yet brought himself to tell his father of his decision, the decision to offer himself as the sacrifice to appease the goddess. How could he bear to see the hope drain from his father's eyes, replaced by the crushing weight of such a sacrifice? He visited the sick, offering what little comfort he could in the form of cool water and soothing words. He helped rebuild the collapsed roofs of homes, the silence of his companions broken only by the rhythmic thud of hammers and the rasp of saws. Yet a sense of unease lingered in the air, a premonition that this reprieve was nothing more than a cruel illusion. The villagers, weakened by disease and grief, seemed to sense it too, their movements hesitant, their voices hushed as if in deference to an unseen presence. Baldev, his own face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, shared Arjan's unease. He organized the villagers into watches, reinforcing the defences of their once peaceful haven. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows across the village, a scout returned from his patrol. His face, usually tanned and weathered from years spent navigating the high passes, was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming!" he gasped, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The Mongols! They are close!" The news spread through the village like wildfire, igniting a panic that threatened to consume their fragile hope. The villagers, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and defiance, gathered in the village square, their voices a cacophony of questions and desperate pleas. Baldev, his voice calm but firm, tried to restore order. He reminded them of their preparations, of the fortified gates, of the weapons they had gathered, and the rudimentary defences they had erected. "We have faced hardship before," he boomed, his voice echoing through the square. We have survived floods and famines, earthquakes and droughts. We will not be broken by these invaders. We will fight for our homes, for our families, for our very survival." His words, infused with a desperate courage, stirred something in the hearts of the villagers. They had lived in peace for generations, their lives dictated by the rhythms of nature and the bonds of community. But beneath their peaceful facade lay a resilience, a fierce determination to protect what was theirs. Arjan, standing beside his father, felt a surge of pride mixed with a chilling certainty. He knew, deep down, that their defences were woefully inadequate against the Mongol horde. These were warriors who had conquered vast empires whose brutality was legendary. As darkness fell and the villagers took their positions on the hastily erected watchtowers and behind the flimsy barricades, Arjan sought out his father. He found him in their small hut, checking their meagre supplies, his face etched with a grim determination. "Father," Arjan began, his voice barely a whisper, "I need to speak with you." Baldev looked up, his eyes filled with a weary affection. "What is it, son?" he asked, his voice softened by concern. Arjan hesitated, the weight of his secret, the burden of his impossible choice, threatening to crush him. How could he tell his father that he had bargained with the goddess, that he had offered his own life in exchange for their survival? "I went to the temple of Kali," Arjan confessed, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. "I sought her protection, for the village, for all of us." Baldev's expression darkened. "Arjan," he began, his voice laced with a warning, "we have spoken of this. The gods are distant, their ways unknowable. We cannot rely on miracles, on bargains struck in the shadows." But Arjan pressed on, his words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and desperation. He told his father about the chilling presence of the goddess, of her terrible beauty, and the aura of power that emanated from her like a tangible force. He described the bargain she offered, a life for a life, a soul offered up in exchange for the protection of the village. Baldev listened in stunned silence, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. When Arjan finished, the silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the oil lamp and the distant sounds of the villagers preparing for the inevitable assault. "You cannot do this, Arjan," Baldev said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. This is madness. We will find another way together." But Arjan shook his head, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty. "There is no other way, father," he said, his voice devoid of hope. "I have seen it. I have felt it. The darkness is coming, and it will consume us all unless—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. Baldev stared at his son, his eyes filled with a pain that cut deeper than any blade. He wanted to argue, to rail against the injustice of it all, to refuse to believe that the only hope for their survival lay in such a horrific sacrifice. But deep down, he knew. He saw the truth in Arjan's eyes, the weight of knowledge that threatened to crush his spirit. The plague, the Mongols, the whispers of ancient evil that haunted their world, it was all connected, part of a tapestry of darkness that was beyond their comprehension. And in that moment of shared despair, they both knew that there was only one choice left to make. A hush fell over the village, a stillness so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The air, thick with the anticipation of violence, carried the distant thunder of hooves, a steady, inexorable beat that heralded the arrival of the Mongol horde. Arjan stood on the makeshift ramparts, his silhouette stark against the rising sun. He had not told his father of his decision, the weight of it too heavy to bear. Instead, he had offered words of comfort, of hope, knowing they rang hollow in the face of the approaching storm. The first rays of dawn glinted off the polished steel of Mongol spears, a chilling spectacle that sent a ripple of fear through the defenders. The Mongol warriors, their faces hidden behind fearsome masks, their horses snorting plumes of steam into the cold morning air, advanced with the precision and discipline of a well-oiled machine. But as the Mongol horde surged toward the village gates, a shadow fell over the land. The air grew suddenly cold, the sun's warmth extinguished as if swallowed by an unseen predator. A collective gasp escaped the defenders as they witnessed an impossible sight. From the depths of the forest, from the very air itself, figures began to materialize, Rakshasas, their forms shifting and swirling like smoke given life, their eyes burning with a malevolent fire. They were a nightmarish menagerie of claws and fangs, of twisted limbs and grotesque features, their very presence a violation of the natural order. Arjan, his heart pounding in his chest, watched as the Rakshasas gathered behind the village, their numbers swelling with each passing moment. He had invited them, had bargained with their kind, and now they answered his call, their presence both terrifying and strangely reassuring. Section 2. A Dance of Death. The Mongol commander, a seasoned veteran of countless campaigns, watched the spectral army materialize with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. He had heard whispers of such creatures, legends told by conquered peoples to instill fear, but he had dismissed them as mere superstition. He raised his hand, signaling his warriors to halt their advance. A low growl, a guttural sound of defiance rippled through the Mongol ranks. They were the inheritors of Genghis Khan's legacy, conquerors who bowed to no man, no beast, no demon. But as the Rakshasa horde surged forward, their forms blurring with unnatural speed, a flicker of doubt, of primal fear, touched the hearts of even the bravest Mongol warriors. The ground trembled beneath their advance, the air thick with the stench of sulphur and decay. The first clash was a cacophony of steel on flesh, of inhuman shrieks and guttural roars. The Rakshasas, their movements a blur of claws and teeth, tore into the Mongol ranks with terrifying ferocity. Mongol arrows, launched in volleys that darkened the sky, seemed to pass harmlessly through the spectral forms of their attackers, their impact marked only by a ripple in the air. The Mongol warriors, their discipline momentarily shattered by the sheer ferocity of the assault, fought back with desperate courage. But their swords and spears found no purchase on the ethereal forms of the Rakshasas, their blows passing through empty air. Arjan, watching the carnage unfold from the ramparts, felt a surge of nausea mixed with a perverse sense of relief. The Rakshasas were keeping their end of the bargain, protecting the village from the Mongol horde. But the price of their intervention was etched in the blood and viscera that stained the battlefield. Section 3. The Price of Silence. The battle, if it could be called that, was short and brutal. The Mongol warriors, their initial shock giving way to terror, broke ranks and fled, their cries of fear echoing across the battlefield. But the Rakshasas, their bloodlust ignited, gave no quarter. They pursued the fleeing Mongols relentlessly, their laughter a chilling symphony of death following close behind. Within hours, silence descended upon the valley. The Mongol horde, once a mighty force that had threatened to consume everything in its path, was no more. The battlefield was a charnel house, a grotesque tapestry of broken bodies and scattered armour, the air thick with the stench of death. Arjan, his stomach churning at the sight, made his way down from the ramparts, his legs shaking beneath him. He had never witnessed such violence, such wanton destruction, and the knowledge that he was in part responsible for it sat heavy on his soul. He found his father amidst the survivors, his face a mask of shock, his eyes wide with a horror that mirrored Arjan's own. What was that?" Baldev stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Arjan, unable to meet his father's gaze, looked away. The image of the carnage seared into his mind. "They were protectors," he said, his voice hollow. "Ancient beings, bound to this land." He could not bring himself to tell his father the truth, to reveal the terrible price of their salvation. The knowledge of his bargain with the Rakshasas, of his own impending fate, was a burden he would carry alone. The villagers, their initial relief giving way to a growing unease, began to murmur amongst themselves. They had witnessed the impossible, had seen their enemies consumed by a force beyond their comprehension, but the victory rang hollow, tainted by the chilling presence of their otherworldly saviours. Arjan knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that the Rakshasas would not remain silent for long. They had tasted blood, had revelled in the chaos and destruction, and they would demand their due. And he, the one who had summoned them, would be there to answer their call. Section 1. A village rebuilt, a soul forfeit. The dust settled over Kimak, the stench of death gradually replaced by the scent of wood smoke and spices. The villagers, their initial shock giving way to a weary acceptance, began the arduous task of rebuilding their lives. The plague was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived, and the Mongol threat had been extinguished in a maelstrom of blood and terror. Life, as it always does, found a way to push through the cracks of their shattered world. Crops were replanted, homes rebuilt, and the rhythms of daily life gradually reasserted themselves. But the memory of that day, the day the Rakshasas descended upon their valley, lingered like a shadow, a chilling reminder of the forces that lay hidden beneath the surface of their world. Arjan was gone, vanished without a trace. Some whispered that he had been taken by the gods, his bravery rewarded with a place among the heavens. Others, their voices hushed with fear, claimed that he had been claimed by the very darkness he had sought to vanquish, his soul forfeit as payment for the village's salvation. Baldev, his face etched with a grief that time could not erase, refused to speak of his son's fate. He led the village with a quiet strength, his eyes reflecting a wisdom born of loss and a deep-seated understanding of the precarious nature of their existence. The village thrived, or at least it gave the appearance of doing so. The fields were bountiful, the harvests plentiful, and the laughter of children once again echoed through the narrow lanes. But beneath the surface, a current of unease lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the price they had paid for their survival. The shrine of Ma Bhairavi, once a place of solace and healing, was left untouched. The garlands of marigolds and jasmine withered and brown. No one spoke her name, no one dared to seek her wisdom in the wake of the devastation that had befallen them. Section 2. The Whispers Remain. Years passed, seasons turned, and gradually the memory of that day faded into legend. The younger generation, who had not witnessed the horrors firsthand, listened to the stories with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The Rakshasas, the Mongols, the plague, they were all part of a distant past, a cautionary tale whispered by the firelight. But the elders, their faces etched with the memories they could not erase, knew better. They remembered the chilling laughter of the Rakshasas, the stench of blood and decay that had lingered in the air long after the battle was over. They remembered Arjan, his courage and his sacrifice, and they mourned him in the silence of their hearts. The world, it seemed, had moved on, oblivious to the forces that lay dormant beneath the surface. Empires rose and fell, wars were fought and won, and the relentless march of time continued unabated. Yet, in the quiet moments when the wind whispered through the trees and the shadows stretched long and thin, the elders of Kimak could still hear them. The faint echoes of inhuman laughter, the rustle of unseen wings, the chilling reminder that some bargains once struck can never be truly forgotten. And in the depths of the forest, hidden among the ancient trees and the tangled undergrowth, a presence stirred. Eyes burning with a cold, malevolent fire watched the village, their gaze filled with a hunger that time could not diminish. The Rakshasas were waiting. Their debt had been paid for now, but they had not forgotten, and they would be back.